Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift upward into a forgotten age of travel, a time when the future of flight seemed to belong not to the roaring airplane, but to vast, silent ships that floated through the sky like clouds given purpose. They were called airships, and for a brief and luminous moment, they were the largest flying machines the world had ever seen. To understand them, we must begin with a very old human longing. Long before engines, before wings, before anyone had truly left the ground, people watched birds and dreamed of rising. The dream was not always of speed, but sometimes simply the wish to float, to drift gently above the fields and rooftops, and to see the world grow small and quiet below. That wish first came true in France in the year 1783. Two brothers, Joseph Michel and Jacques-Étienne Montgolfier, sent a great cloth and paper balloon into the air above Paris, lifted by nothing more than heated air. That same year, another inventor named Jacques Charles rose into the same skies beneath a balloon filled with hydrogen, a gas lighter than the air around it. The principle behind these flights was beautifully simple. A gas lighter than the surrounding air will rise just as a bubble rises through water. There was no need for flapping wings or great struggle. The sky would simply hold you if only you could become light enough to be lifted. And yet, these first balloons carried a quiet frustration within them. They could rise and they could fall, but they could not be steered. They drifted wherever the wind chose to carry them, helpless as seeds on a breeze, and to truly travel, one needed to choose a direction. So a new dream took shape, slower and more stubborn than the first. Inventors began to imagine a balloon that could be guided, a vessel with an engine, a rudder, and a will of its own. The French gave this idea a fitting name, calling such a craft a dirigible, from a word meaning to direct or to steer. The first real success came in 1852, when a French engineer named Henri Giffard fitted a small steam engine to a long, tapered balloon and flew it slowly across the countryside. It was gentle, underpowered, and easily defeated by a strong wind. But it could be aimed, and that small triumph changed everything. If these slow journeys help you drift toward sleep, you are welcome to follow SleepWise and share it with someone who might enjoy learning something gentle as they fade into rest. For half a century, these steerable airships remained small, fragile, and largely experimental. But in a quiet corner of Germany, an aging count was about to imagine something far grander, a flying ship with a skeleton of metal and a hull longer than a city street, and with it, the true age of the great airships was about to begin. The man who imagined this was named Ferdinand von Zeppelin, a German count and retired army officer who, as a younger man, had once gone up in a balloon while observing a distant war in America. He was no longer young when the idea took hold of him, and many who knew him thought it the harmless obsession of an aging soldier. Yet he believed something others did not, that the future of the air belonged not to the small drifting balloon, but to a vessel far larger and far more deliberate. His central insight was structural. Instead of a single soft bag of gas, he imagined a rigid skeleton of light metal, a great frame that would hold its shape no matter what. Inside that frame, separate cells of gas would provide the lift, while the whole craft could be built longer and stronger than anything that had flown before. On a summer day in the year 1900, his first creation rose from a floating shed on Lake Constance, near the southern edge of Germany. It was long and silver and strange, and it climbed slowly into the air above the water while crowds watched from the shore. The flight lasted only minutes, and the ship was awkward and underpowered, but it had risen, and that was enough to begin. What followed were years of difficulty. His early ships were damaged by wind, dismantled for lack of money, or simply fell short of their promise. The funds dwindled, the doubters grew louder, and more than once the entire dream seemed ready to collapse beneath its own cost. Then came the day that should have ended everything. In the year 1908, one of his airships set out on a long demonstration flight, only to be forced down near a village called Echterdingen. As it sat moored to the ground, a sudden storm tore it loose, and within moments the hydrogen caught fire, and the great ship was consumed. It was a ruinous loss, but something unexpected happened in its wake. Ordinary people across Germany, moved by what they had seen and read, began sending money of their own accord, a flood of small gifts and large that came to be remembered almost as a miracle. That outpouring rescued the enterprise. With it, a proper company and foundation were established, and the work could continue on solid ground at last. The aging Count, so often dismissed, had been lifted by the very public that would soon ride his ships. With the company secured, the airships soon found a peaceful purpose. In the years before the Great War, a new venture carried paying passengers on excursions above the German countryside, the first enterprise of its kind in the world. Tens of thousands drifted over fields and rivers, and the great ship seemed, for a time, destined only for wonder. Before we follow these giants out into the wider world, though, it helps to pause and understand what they truly were. How could something so vast hang so gently in the sky? And what exactly kept it there? To understand a rigid airship, it helps to imagine it from the inside out, beginning not with a silver skin, but with the bones beneath it. At the heart of every such ship was a skeleton, a framework of slender metal girders and great circular rings that gave the vessel its permanent shape. Early frames were built of aluminum, and later of a stronger, lighter alloy called duralumin, prized because it added strength without adding much weight. This rigid frame was the key difference that set these ships apart. Unlike a simple balloon, which holds its form only through the pressure of the gas within, a rigid airship kept its shape whether it was full or nearly empty. The skeleton carried the load, and the gas was left free simply to lift. Within that frame hung a row of separate gas cells, like great lungs held inside a rib cage. In the earliest ships, these sails were made from a delicate material known as gold beater's skin, prepared from the thin membrane of cattle, a material so light and gas-tight that a single great ship might use the membranes of hundreds of thousands of animals. Over the whole frame was stretched an outer covering of treated fabric, which gave the ship its smooth shape and shielded it from the weather, but held no gas of its own. The lift itself came from buoyancy, the same gentle force that lets a bubble rise through water. The gas inside was lighter than the air outside, so the air pressed in and carried the ship upward. To rise meant becoming lighter than the air one displaced. To sink meant becoming a little heavier. The gas of choice for most of this story was hydrogen. It was the lightest element of all, easy to produce and wonderfully good at lifting. It carried, however, one grave flaw, for hydrogen burns fiercely, and a single spark in the wrong place could undo everything. Flying such a ship was an endless, delicate balancing act. The crew carried water as ballast, releasing it to climb and venting precious gas to descend. As fuel burned away during a voyage, the ship grew lighter on its own, and the commander had to manage lift and weight as carefully as a sailor reads the sea. For movement and steering, engines hung in cars beneath the hull, turning propellers that pushed the ship forward through the air. At the tail were broad fins and movable surfaces, rudders to turn left and right, elevators to tilt the nose up or down. A craft without a skeleton, by contrast, was called a blimp, holding its shape by the pressure of its gas alone. So this was the airship, a metal skeleton, a cluster of breathing gas cells, a skin of fabric, and a fragile, flammable heart. Inside the hull ran narrow walkways where the crew could move from end to end, tending the cells and engines in flight. And yet the first great task the world would find for these gentle giants was neither travel nor wonder, but war. The terms of the peace were heavy. and they reached even into the sky. Among the conditions imposed upon defeated Germany were strict limits on its aircraft and its airships, and many of the surviving Zeppelins were ordered to be handed over to the victors. Rather than surrender their ships intact, some German crews are said to have wrecked them where they sat, leaving little for the others to claim. The old Count did not live to see this twilight. Ferdinand von Zeppelin had died in the year 1917, while the war still raged, never knowing how his ships would fare in the peace that followed. The future of his life's work now rested in other hands. Those hands belonged to a man named Hugo Eckener. He had come to airships not as an engineer, but as a writer sent years before to report on Zeppelin's work, only to be drawn so deeply into the dream that he became one of its finest commanders. Patient, careful, and gifted at reading both the weather and the public mood, he set himself to keeping the company alive. It was a precarious time. With construction restricted and money scarce, the great sheds at Friedrichshafen stood in danger of falling silent for good. Eckener needed a way to prove that the airship still had a future, and to do so without breaking the terms imposed from abroad. He found his answer in an unlikely place. Germany would build a new airship not for itself, but for the United States, offered as part of the reparations it owed. In the year 1924, this ship was made ready, and the task of delivering it fell to Eckener himself. The delivery was no short hop, but a crossing of the whole Atlantic Ocean. Eckener guided the great silver ship from southern Germany out over the open sea, through long hours of darkness and weather, all the way to a naval station in New Jersey. The ship arrived safely and was taken into American service under a new name. In its new home, the ship was filled not with hydrogen, but with helium, a rarer gas that would not burn, drawn from wells beneath the American earth. Renamed for a city in the West, it went on to serve quietly for many years, the safest and most successful airship its Navy would ever fly. Helium was precious and closely guarded, however, and almost the whole of the world's supply lay in American hands. The meaning of that flight reached far beyond a single delivery. It had shown plainly and peacefully that a giant airship could cross an ocean and arrive whole at the far shore. What had once been a weapon of war now hinted at something gentler, a bridge between continents, carried on the wind. And so the dream, so nearly extinguished, drew breath again. Soon a new ship would rise from those same sheds, one built to carry passengers in comfort, not merely across an ocean, but around the entire turning world. Its name would become, for a time, among the most celebrated in the sky. The new ship rose into the world in the year 1928, and it bore the old Count's name and title, the Graf Zeppelin. It was the largest airship yet built for the carrying of passengers, and from the very start it seemed to belong to a gentler future than the one the war had threatened. Under Hugo Eckener's careful command, it was about to become the most celebrated flying machine on Earth. Within a year of its first flight, Eckener set out to attempt something that had never been done. The Graf Zeppelin would circle the entire globe, carrying a small group of passengers and journalists in a single grand voyage. The journey was paid for in part by an American newspaper magnate, eager for the story it would tell. The route was breathtaking in its sweep. From its home in southern Germany, the ship flew eastward across Europe and the vast, empty expanse of Siberia, a single unbroken leg of thousands of miles, all the way to Japan. From there, it crossed the wide Pacific to the coast of America, and then back across the Atlantic to Europe and home. The whole circumnavigation took only about 3 weeks. To a world that still measured long journeys in months aboard ships and trains, this was astonishing. A vessel had floated around the entire planet quietly and returned to the very place it began. Everywhere it went, crowds gathered to watch it pass. In Tokyo, in Los Angeles, in city after city, people poured into the streets to glimpse the silver shape moving overhead. Ekina returned to acclaim and celebration, welcomed with parades, and the airship seemed, to many, to be the certain future of travel. In the years that followed, the ship went on to feats that read almost like adventure tales. It journeyed into the frozen Arctic on a voyage of exploration, drifting above pack ice and lonely coasts where almost no one had ever been. Wherever there was something remote and difficult to reach, the great airship seemed somehow able to go. And there was reason to believe it. Across the ocean, the airship could outpace the fastest ships afloat, crossing in a few days what took a great liner the better part of a week. It flew smoothly, without the pitching of the sea, and it carried its passengers in a comfort no aeroplane of the age could hope to match. For a few short years, the world allowed itself to imagine a coming age of airships. Great floating liners would link the continents, drifting between capitals as ocean ships drifted between ports. The future, it seemed, might well be lighter than air. But what was it actually like to travel this way, to cross an ocean suspended quietly above the waves? For all its records and its fame, the deepest appeal of the airship lay not in its speed at all, but in the strange serenity of the voyage itself. To understand the dream fully, we must step aboard into the hushed and curious world of the airship's passengers. To step aboard one of these great ships was to enter a world unlike any other in travel. The passenger quarters were not in the gondola alone, but built into the body of the ship itself, a series of rooms suspended within the vast hull. There were cabins for sleeping, a dining saloon, a lounge, and long windowed galleries where one could stand and watch the world drift by. Perhaps the most surprising feature was the promenade. Along the sides of the ship ran great sloping windows, and because the airship flew low and was not sealed against the outside air, those windows could be slid open in flight. Passengers leaned at the rail with the wind upon their faces, watching the ocean pass only a few hundred feet below. That low, unhurried view was one of the great gifts of airship travel. Where later, aircraft would carry people miles above the earth, sealed behind glass and cloud, the airship drifted close enough to see the texture of the world. Ships left their long wakes upon the water, coastlines slowly unrolled, and fields and rooftops passed beneath like images in a quiet dream. And it was astonishingly smooth. There was none of the rolling and pitching of a ship at sea, none of the sudden drops of later flight. Passengers liked to say that a pen could stand on end upon a table, or that water sat perfectly still within a glass as the great ship slid through the air. The quiet, too, was remarkable. The engines hung in their cars away from the cabins, so that within the lounge one heard little more than soft conversation and the faint murmur of the wind. Meals were served on fine china, course by course, much as they would be in the dining room of a good hotel. Everything aboard was built to be as light as possible. The chairs and tables were slender and spare, often formed from hollow aluminum, and even small fittings were chosen for their lightness. On a ship that floated by the narrowest of margins, every needless ounce worked against the lift. Yet, woven through all this comfort was the quiet shadow of the gas overhead. Because hydrogen could be set alight by the smallest flame, open fire was the great forbidden thing aboard. There were no candles, no careless matches, and for a long while no smoking of any kind at all. On the grander ships, this gave rise to one of the strangest rooms ever built. A single smoking lounge was sealed away behind an airlock and kept at a slightly higher pressure, so that no trace of hydrogen could ever seep inside. Within it sat one electric lighter, fixed in place, for no passenger was permitted to carry a flame of their own. For those who traveled this way, the journey itself became the destination, a few timeless days suspended between continents. And before long such crossings would settle into something almost ordinary, a regular service running back and forth across the sea on a schedule as dependable as the tides. In time, the great adventure became a timetable. The Graf Zeppelin settled into regular service across the ocean, carrying passengers and mail on a route that ran from Germany all the way to South America. It was the first scheduled passenger service of its kind in the world, a thread of air between two continents. The path it followed was shaped by the geography of the globe. Rather than crossing the wide northern ocean, the ship flew south, down over Spain and the western edge of Africa, to where the Atlantic narrows between that coast and the bulge of Brazil. There the crossing was shortest, and there the airship made its long, steady passage over open water. The far end of the journey was the city of Rio de Janeiro, set between green mountains and the sea, a voyage that began in the cool gray autumn of Europe would end a few days later in the bright warmth of the tropics. Passengers watched the world change beneath them, from the fields of Europe to the sands of Africa to the wide emptiness of the Southern Ocean. Season after season, the ship made these crossings, and slowly the marvel became a matter of routine. What had once drawn crowds into the streets became simply the way that certain travelers crossed the sea. The extraordinary had quietly turned ordinary, which is perhaps the truest mark of any success. There grew up even a thriving trade in airship mail. Collectors prized the letters that had crossed the ocean by Zeppelin, each stamped to mark its passage through the air. The safety record was remarkable. Over the course of its long career, the Graf Zeppelin flew more than 1,000,000 miles and crossed the equator many times, carrying thousands of passengers without a single one of them coming to harm. It was, by almost any measure, one of the safest ways anyone had ever traveled. There was a rhythm to these voyages that suited the slowness of the ship. Days passed in reading and conversation, in watching the ocean and the changing sky, in the long quiet that only such travel allowed. The world below moved at the pace of the water, and the passengers moved gently with it. For the crew, the route became as familiar as a well-known road. They learned its weather and its winds, the look of the African coast, and the first sight of land upon the far side. A voyage that would have seemed impossible a generation before had become a steady job of work, done well and done often. It is worth resting here a moment in these calm and successful years because they did not feel like the middle of a story. To those who lived them, the age of the airship seemed not to be passing at all, but only beginning. The great ships flew on, and few imagined how soon the sky would change, for Germany was not alone in its ambition. Far to the north, another nation had been watching all the while and dreaming its own dream of a great empire bound together by these silver ships. That nation was Britain, whose empire stretched so far around the world that no ship or train could easily hold it together. To its leaders, the airship offered a tempting answer. Great flying vessels might carry passengers and mail from London to India, to Egypt, to Canada, and distant Australia, binding the scattered empire with threads of air. And so the government set in motion an ambitious plan, often called the Imperial airship scheme. It would build great airships to serve these long imperial routes, larger and more capable than anything Britain had flown before. The dream was nothing less than to shrink the empire, to bring its farthest corners within a few days' journey of home. What made the plan unusual was the way it chose to proceed. Two great ships would be built at the same time by two very different hands. One would be made by a private company and the other by the government itself. And in a sense, the two were set quietly against each other, each to show which approach could better serve the dream. The privately built ship took the more cautious path. Its designers drew on proven ideas and familiar methods, and when it was finished, it proved a sound and capable vessel. In time, it made a long voyage all the way to Canada and back, crossing the ocean and returning safely to show just what it could do. The government ship took a bolder course. It was filled with new and untried ideas, intended to be the most advanced airship in all the world, but it proved troublesome from the start, heavier than hoped and short of lift, so that at one point it had to be cut apart and lengthened simply to make it fly as planned. Around this great ship there gathered a swell of pressure and of pride. It had become a symbol of the nation's ambition, and important men had staked their reputations upon it. There was a strong wish to see it fly to India soon, to prove the dream before the watching world, and that wish pressed hard against the caution such a venture truly deserved. Part of the haste had a particular cause. A great gathering of the empire's leaders was soon to be held in London, and there was a wish for the ship to make its flight to India and return in time to be spoken of there. A voyage that ought to have waited upon readiness was instead bent to fit a date upon a calendar. So the preparations were hurried along. The ship was made ready for its first real voyage, a long passage toward India, even as some who knew it best are said to have carried quiet doubts about whether it was truly prepared. The great vessel was filled with hydrogen, loaded heavy with fuel, and brought at last to its mooring mast to wait. On an evening in early autumn in the year 1930, the order came at last to depart. The great ship slipped its mast and turned south into a darkening wind-swept sky, out toward the sea and toward France that lay beyond it. The whole of the British dream now seemed to ride upon this single voyage. If the great ship reached India and came safely home again, the future of the airship across the empire would be assured. And so it pressed on into the autumn night, heavy with fuel and with hope. If you have been drifting along with this story, you need not follow every turn of it now. You might let the words grow soft and distant as you settle a little deeper. And if these quiet journeys help carry you toward sleep, a gentle follow or a share lets others find their own way here, too. The ship crossed the south of England and went out over the Channel. But the weather had turned hard against it. Rain came down in sheets, and a strong wind pushed and pulled at the great hull as it labored over northern France. Low and heavy, the ship struggled to hold its height against the storm. For a time, the ship pushed on through the wind and the rain, and all seemed to be holding. The crew worked through the night to keep her steady and upon her course, trusting in the great vessel beneath them. There was, as yet, no sign at all of the disaster that lay only minutes ahead. In the small hours of the morning, near the town of Beauvais in northern France, the ship at last sank lower than it could afford to. It met the rising ground almost gently, slowly, and then the hydrogen found its spark. In a matter of moments, the great vessel was wrapped entirely in fire. Of the 54 people aboard, only 6 lived through that night. Among those who were lost were the very men who had championed the ship, the leaders and officials who had staked so much upon its success. The dream and many of its dreamers were gone together in a quiet field far from home. In truth, more lives were lost that night than would later be lost in the airship disaster the world best remembers. Yet because it came in darkness, in a foreign field, it has slipped from the common memory. The dead were brought home together, and great silent crowds lined the streets as they passed. The shock of it reached deep into the nation. Britain, which had dreamed of binding its whole empire with airships, lost its faith in them almost at once. The voyage that was meant to prove the dream had instead, in a single night, quietly ended it. The other great ship, the one built by private hands, had done everything that was ever asked of it and had crossed an ocean safely. Yet it never flew again. In the wake of the disaster, it was grounded, taken apart, and sold away for scrap, a sound machine retired for the failure of its rival. And so one great chapter of the dream closed in mourning. In Germany, the great ship still flew on, and would for some years to come. Yet even then, far across the ocean, another nation was quietly building airships of an entirely different kind, lifted not by hydrogen at all, but by a gas that would not burn. That nation was the United States, and its great advantage lay deep beneath its own soil. From certain wells in its southern plains came helium, a gas almost as light as hydrogen, but utterly unwilling to burn. Alone among the powers of the world, America held this safer gas in abundance, and it guarded the supply closely. There was something almost poetic in the gas they used. Helium had first been found not on Earth at all, but in the light of the sun, and it took its name from the old Greek word for the sun itself. Only later was it discovered seeping from wells deep in the American ground. With it, the United States Navy set out to build airships of its own. If the European ships had been kept aloft by a gas that might catch fire, these American giants would float upon one that could not. It seemed, at last, like the answer to the airship's oldest and deepest fear. Two great ships were built for this purpose, named for American cities, the Akron and the Macon. They were constructed in a vast hangar in Ohio by a partnership of American and German hands, drawing upon all that the Zeppelin men had learned. Each was among the largest things that had ever flown, nearly 800 feet from nose to tail. But their purpose was not to carry passengers in comfort. They were built as scouts for the Navy, great floating eyes meant to roam far out over the oceans and watch for distant ships. In an age before radar, a vessel that could see for hundreds of miles was a prize worth pursuing. And these ships held a wonder within them that seemed to belong to a storybook. Deep inside the hull was a hangar, and within that hangar waited small fighter aeroplanes carried aloft inside the airship itself. The great ship was, in effect, a flying aircraft carrier sailing through the sky with its own little squadron tucked inside. The way these planes came and went was stranger still. Beneath the airship hung a kind of trapeze, a bar that could be lowered down into the open air below. A pilot would fly up beneath the moving ship, hook his aeroplane onto the bar, and be lifted gently up and inside as though plucked from the sky by an unseen hand. To launch, the process simply ran in reverse. The little plane was lowered upon its trapeze into the rushing air, released to fall away and fly off on its own, then caught again when its work was done. It was a delicate trick, performed high above the sea, and for a time it worked beautifully. The men who flew these little planes had one of the strangest tasks in all the Navy. They hooked onto a swinging bar high in the open sky, with nothing below them but air and sea. For a few short years, it seemed America had found a safer path into the age of the airship. Helium had taken away the danger of fire, but fire, as the Navy would soon learn, had never been the only thing the airship had to fear. The first of the two great ships did not last long. On a stormy night in the spring of 1933, the Akron was flying off the coast of New Jersey when it ran into violent weather. The air itself seemed to turn against it, with savage gusts that pressed the great ship down toward the waves. In the darkness and the rain, the ship was driven lower than its captain could prevent. Its tail struck the surface of the sea, and the great vessel broke apart and went down into the cold Atlantic water. There were no flames at all, for there was no hydrogen to burn, and yet the disaster was the worst the airship had ever known. Of the more than 70 men aboard, only 3 were saved. The water was bitterly cold, and there were too few life jackets and no rescue close at hand, so that most who survived the crash itself were lost to the sea. Among the dead was the admiral who had been the great champion of these ships, gone down with the very vessel he believed in. To this day, the loss of that ship remains the deadliest disaster in all the history of the airship. More lives were taken upon that single stormy night than in any fire before or since. A nation that had pinned high hopes upon these vessels was left to grieve and to wonder. It was a grievous blow, deadlier even than the loss in France a few years before, and it carried a hard lesson within it. The safe gas had kept its promise and had not burned, and yet the ship was gone all the same, taken not by fire, but by the sky. Less than 2 years later, the second ship met a similar fate. The Macon was flying off the coast of California when a storm caught it and tore at its upper tail, where the structure had already been weakened. A fin gave way, gas began to escape, and slowly the great ship started to sink toward the ocean. But this time the ending was kinder. The Navy had learned from the loss of the first ship, and now the airships carried life jackets and rafts enough for all aboard. As the Macon settled gently onto the water, almost everyone climbed out and was saved, and of more than 80 men, only 2 were lost. The difference between the 2 endings was stark and full of meaning. The first ship had taken nearly all her crew down with her into the cold. The second gave almost all of hers back to the world. The same disaster, met with a little more care, had become survivable. Still, the meaning was plain enough. In the space of 2 years, both of America's great airships were gone, and neither of them to fire. The very size that made these ships so majestic also made them fragile, strained by storms that a smaller craft might have ridden out. And so the American experiment quietly came to its end. The story now returned across the ocean to Germany, where the greatest airship ever built was about to rise, carrying within it a deep and troubling contradiction. The new ship was named the Hindenburg, and it was the largest object ever to fly. It stretched more than 800 feet through the air, nearly the length of a great ocean liner, a silver giant that dwarfed everything that had come before it. To stand beneath it was to stand in the shadow of a floating cathedral. It had been designed from the very beginning to float upon helium, the safe gas that would not burn. Its makers knew the dangers of hydrogen well, and they meant for this great ship to carry its passengers above the sea without that ancient fear. But helium, as we have seen, lay almost entirely in American hands. And America would not sell it. Fearful of how the gas might be used by other nations and wary of the government that now ruled Germany, the United States held its helium back. So the greatest airship ever built, designed to be safe, was filled instead with the very gas its makers had hoped to leave behind. This was the quiet contradiction at the heart of the Hindenburg. It was a masterpiece of care and engineering, wrapped around a cargo of flammable gas it had never been meant to carry. The danger had not been removed, only accepted, because there was simply no other way to make the ship fly. For those aboard, none of this shadowed the splendor of the voyage. The Hindenburg carried its passengers in a luxury greater than any airship before it, with a grand dining room, a writing room, and a lounge that looked out through great windows upon the world below. There was even a piano, built specially of lightweight metal, so that it might be carried without weighing the great ship down. In the year 1936, the Hindenburg began to cross the Atlantic in regular service. It carried passengers from Germany to North America in only 2 or 3 days, and onward to Brazil as well, swift and smooth above the waves. In a single season, it made many crossings, and the dream of the airship seemed gloriously alive once more. By the close of that first season, confidence in the great ship ran high. It had crossed the ocean again and again without trouble, carrying the wealthy and the curious in perfect safety. Tickets for the coming year sold briskly, and the future of the airship seemed once more assured. Yet the ship was also a creature of its troubled time. It flew in the service of a Germany now fallen into dark hands, and upon its great tail fins it bore the harsh emblems of that regime. The most beautiful airship ever built moved through the sky beneath the signs of one of history's cruelest powers. As a new season opened in the spring of 1937, the Hindenburg set out once more across the ocean toward America. On the evening of its arrival, it drifted at last over its landing field in New Jersey, where a crowd had gathered in the fading light to watch the great ship come in. The evening was gray and unsettled, for thunderstorms had passed over the field at Lakehurst and delayed the landing by several hours. At last the weather cleared enough, and the great ship moved in slowly over the waiting crowd. Lines were dropped from the bow down to the ground crew below to draw the Hindenburg gently down to its mast. What happened next took less than a minute. Near the tail of the ship, a small flame appeared, and in an instant it bloomed into a great fire. The hydrogen that filled the hull caught all at once, and the back of the ship became a roaring column of flame against the darkening sky. The great vessel sank to the ground as it burned, settling down through its own fire in moments. There was almost no time to think at all. Yet because the ship came down so quickly and so close to the earth, many of those aboard were able to leap from the windows and run, or were pulled from the wreckage by the brave ground crew. In the end, of the nearly 100 people aboard, 2/3 came through alive. 35 who had been on the ship were lost, along with one man on the ground in the space of half a minute. It was a terrible toll, and yet, given the speed and the fury of the fire, it was a wonder that so many lived. What had set the fire alight was never known for certain, and it is debated to this day. The likeliest explanation is a sad and simple one, that hydrogen had been leaking from the ship, and a small spark of static in the storm air was enough to set it ablaze. A single unlucky spark, in the wrong moment. What set this disaster apart was not its scale, for others had been far deadlier. It was that the whole of it had been seen. Cameras had been waiting to film the great ship's arrival, and so the fire was captured and shown in newsreels all around the world, watched again and again by millions. A radio reporter had been speaking as the ship came in, describing the calm and ordinary scene below him. As the flames erupted, his voice broke, and he wept openly into the microphone at the horror unfolding before him. That recording, raw with grief, would be remembered for as long as the disaster itself. And so it was that this fire, though not the worst the airship had known, became the one the world could never forget. The pictures were simply too vivid, and the sorrow too plainly heard. In 30 short seconds, the public's faith in the great airships had burned away with the ship. In the wake of that fire, no great passenger airship would ever fly a paying voyage again. The brief and shining era of crossing the ocean by lighter-than-air ship had come very suddenly to its close. It is tempting to say that the airship died that evening at the mooring mast, but the truth, as it so often is, was quieter and more complicated than the flames suggested. The dream had been failing for many reasons long before that final fire. To understand why the airship faded, we must set the famous fire to one side for a moment. The flames at the mooring mast were vivid and unforgettable, but they were the symptom of a deeper trouble, not its true cause. The great airship was being defeated, slowly, by problems that no single gas could ever solve. Consider first the question of the gas itself. Hydrogen lifted well and cost little, but it could burn, as the world had now seen far too clearly. Helium would not burn, but it was rare and costly, and almost all of it lay under the control of a single nation unwilling to share. This was a trap with no easy way out. A great airship could be cheap and dangerous, lifted by hydrogen, or safe and dependent upon a gas it might never be allowed to buy. Either path led to trouble, and there was no third gas waiting anywhere to rescue the dream. Then there was the weather, which had proved a relentless enemy. The very size that made these ships so grand also made them fragile, strained and tossed by storms that smaller craft could fly above or around. 3 of the greatest airships ever built had been lost to weather alone, without any fire at all. There was also the simple matter of speed. An airship crossed the ocean in 2 or 3 days, which had once seemed a miracle. But the aeroplane was growing swifter with every passing year. Against a machine that might make the same crossing in mere hours, the slow and stately airship began to look like a vessel of the past, and the costs were enormous. A great airship needed vast sheds to house it, large crews to fly it, and small armies of men on the ground to wrestle it down to its mast. For all this expense, it carried only a few dozen passengers, where a ship could carry thousands, and the aeroplane was learning to carry more and more. In a way, the airship had always lived within a narrow gap. It was faster than the ocean liner and, for a time, able to fly where no aeroplane could yet go. But that gap was steadily closing from both sides. until there was almost no room left in between. When all of these troubles are set side by side, the picture becomes clear. The airship was slow, costly, fragile in storms, and forced to choose between danger and a gas it could not freely obtain. The fire at the mast did not truly kill the dream. It only made plain a weakness that had been there all along. There is no villain in this ending, and no single failure to blame. The airship was simply a wonderful answer to a question the world had quietly stopped asking. For waiting in the wings, growing stronger year by year, was the very rival that would inherit the open sky. While the great airships had drifted slowly between the continents, the aeroplane had been quietly learning to fly farther, faster, and higher than ever before. The aeroplane had begun as a frail and noisy thing, hopping short distances close to the ground, but it improved with astonishing speed, far faster than the great airship ever could. Every year the engines grew stronger, the wings more capable, and the distances they crossed grew longer. At first, crossing the great ocean still seemed beyond them, for there was nowhere to land out upon the water. The answer, for a time, was the flying boat, an aeroplane built to rest upon the sea itself. Great winged boats began to carry passengers across the Pacific and the Atlantic, alighting in sheltered harbors along the way. These flying boats were themselves a kind of marvel, and for a brief while they shared the long ocean routes with the airship. They were faster than the great silver ships, and they did not need the vast sheds and the huge ground crews that an airship demanded. Slowly, the balance of the future began to tip toward wings. Some of these great flying boats became famous in their own right. The clippers that carried travelers across the Pacific in a series of ocean hops. For a few short years, they were the very height of luxury in the air. Then came a great war, and it changed everything in the air. The need for long-range bombers and transports drove the aeroplane forward by decades in only a handful of years. Engines, navigation, and the sheer reach of aircraft all leapt ahead until flying vast distances had become an ordinary thing. When the war was over, this new power was turned toward peace. Land-based airliners, faster and larger than ever before, began to carry passengers across the oceans on regular schedules. Before long, they flew high above the clouds in sealed and pressurized cabins, untroubled by the very storms that had once torn the airships apart. In time, the airliner gave way to the jet, and the oceans shrank further still. A crossing that once took the airship 3 slow days could now be made between a morning and an afternoon. The world had never moved so fast, and showed no wish to slow down again. Against all of this, the airship simply had no answer. The aeroplane was faster, and it grew cheaper with every passing year. It could climb above the weather rather than struggle through it, and it needed no floating shed nor any army of men to bring it down to earth. And so, quietly, the long contest ended. The qualities the airship had offered, its smoothness, its open windows, its slow and dreamlike passage above the sea, were the very things a hurrying world had decided it no longer wished to pay for. Speed had won, and comfort of that gentle kind was set aside. The great rigid airships vanished from the sky, and their vast sheds fell silent, one by one. And yet the idea behind them did not quite die away. It grew smaller and quieter, and drifted off toward the edges of the world, where a few faint traces of it linger even now. The great rigid airships were gone, but lighter-than-air flight did not vanish from the world entirely. It simply grew smaller and humbler, finding quieter work to do. The dream did not die so much as scatter into pieces, each carried off into a different corner of life. One of these pieces was the blimp, the smaller cousin of the great airships, holding its shape by gas pressure alone with no rigid frame inside. When another great war came, blimps were sent out over the coasts, and the convoys, drifting slowly above the sea to watch for submarines lurking below. Patient and tireless, they kept their long vigil over the ships they guarded. These patient patrols proved their worth. Through all the long years of that war, the convoys watched over by airships rarely lost a ship to the enemy below. The slow blimp drifting overhead was a comfort and a shield to the vessels it guarded. After that war, the blimp found a gentler calling. It became a familiar sight above stadiums and great gatherings, drifting lazily over the crowds with cameras aboard to look down upon the games below. Where once the airship had been a vessel of empires, it had become a quiet companion to a summer afternoon. Here and there, a few small airships still drift for pleasure alone, carrying sightseers gently above cities and coastlines. For those aboard, it is a small echo of a vanished age, a brief taste of that old and unhurried way of moving through the sky. There were other lingering forms as well. During the war, great tethered balloons had been raised above cities and beaches, their trailing cables meant to fend off low-flying aircraft. These barrage balloons floated like silent sentinels, doing their work simply by hanging in the air and being there. Smaller still were the balloons of science, and these endured to this very day. Each day, all around the world, slender balloons are released into the sky, carrying instruments up through the clouds to measure the weather far above. They rise until the thinning air lets them swell and burst, and their findings drift back down to earth. And then there was the gas itself, which found a long afterlife of its own. Helium, once the precious lifting gas of navies, now cools the great magnets of the machines that peer inside the human body and fills the bright balloons of children's parties. The same element that once carried airships across the sea had quietly entered hospitals and homes. There is something fitting in all of this. A grand idea, having failed at its largest and proudest scale, lived on in 100 smaller and more useful ways. The dream of floating did not end. It only learned a kind of humility. And yet, every so often, the older and grander dream stirs again. Now and then, someone looks up, imagines the great ships returning, and begins to wonder whether their time might somehow come round once more. For the airship has never been quite forgotten, nor entirely abandoned. Every generation or so, the old dream awakens, and someone proposes that the great ships might fly again. The idea has a way of returning, like a tune half remembered from long ago, and there are good reasons it keeps coming back. An airship needs no runway and can rise straight up and hover in place, reaching remote and roadless lands that other craft cannot easily serve. It can lift enormous and awkward loads, and it sips its fuel slowly, drifting upon its buoyancy rather than fighting gravity with brute power. Imagine a load too heavy and too large for any road or railway, lifted whole into the air and carried over mountains and forests to some far and roadless place. Imagine a vessel that could hang above a wilderness or a coastline for days on end, watching quietly over all that lay below. These are the visions that keep the dream alive. So the proposals come in one form and then another. Some imagine great airships carrying heavy cargo to distant places that have no roads or ports. Others picture them hanging high in the sky for days on end, patient eyes watching over the land and sea below. In a world grown weary of haste, the airship's very slowness has begun to seem like a virtue once again. It promises a way to move gently and to burn little, a calmer and cleaner manner of crossing the sky. To some, this is precisely the appeal. Not speed at all, but grace. And yet, again and again, the great revival does not quite arrive. A promising design appears, stirs a wave of excitement, and then quietly falters. The old problems return, the costs mount, the weather still waits, and the world's habits, built so firmly around the aeroplane, prove very hard to change. For the airship's old troubles never fully went away. It is still a vast and delicate thing, hard to handle on the ground and easily pushed about by the wind. It still needs great space to be housed and many hands to be managed, and it still moves slowly through a world that prizes speed above almost all else. It is a curious pattern, repeated now for many decades. The airship is forever about to return, forever on the edge of its second age, and yet that age keeps slipping just beyond its reach. The dream persists, but it does not quite take flight. Perhaps one day it truly will, in some new form not yet imagined. Or perhaps it will remain what it has been for so long, a beautiful possibility hovering always at the margin of the future. For now, the great ships of the past remain mostly memories, and the great ships of tomorrow remain mostly dreams. Either way, the story leaves us with something to ponder as the night grows deeper around us. It asks us to consider not only what was built, but what might have been, and why the world so often chooses one path and quietly lets another slip away. The story of the airship is, in the end, a story about the roads that history does not take. We often imagine that the best ideas simply win, and that progress moves in a straight and certain line. But the truth is gentler and stranger than that. The airship did not fade because it was foolish, or because no one wished it well. It faded for reasons of timing and cost, of politics and accident, of a single scarce gas held in distant hands. It was a fine answer that happened to arrive in an unkind season, beside a rival that grew up faster than anyone had expected. And so it became one of history's great might-have-beens. We can almost picture the other path, a world in which crossing an ocean meant days of calm and comfort, drifting high above the water in a floating room, rather than racing through the sky sealed inside a narrow tube. That world was possible once, and the century chose otherwise. There is no use mourning it too deeply, for the choice the world made brought wonders of its own. The aeroplane carried millions where the airship could carry only a few, and it bound the continents together far more tightly than the great ships ever could. Speed, for all that is lost within it, is its own kind of gift. And still, something was lost when the airships went. A way of traveling that made the journey itself a pleasure, rather than a thing to be hurried through. We gained the whole world in an afternoon and gave up the slow crossing and the quiet it once allowed. Yet it is worth remembering that such choices are always being made. In every age, some inventions flourish while others, no less clever or beautiful, are quietly set aside. What survives is not always what was best, but what fit the moment, the money, and the mood of its time. The airship reminds us of this with unusual grace. It was not a mistake, but a path the world declined to walk, a future that shimmered for a while and then softly faded. To look back upon it is to glimpse all the other futures that might have been, hovering just out of sight behind the one we know. It is a pattern far older than the airship and far larger than it. The history of invention is full of such gentle ghosts of clever and lovely things that worked, that people admired, and that simply did not last. They linger at the edges of our story, reminding us that progress is a matter of choice as much as of merit. And perhaps that is a fitting thought to carry toward sleep. The world we live in is only one of many that could have been, shaped as much by chance and timing as by any grand design. There is a strange comfort in that, and a quiet humility too. So let the great ships drift now to the very edge of memory, neither mourned nor forgotten, but simply held for a moment in the mind. And let us turn, as the story closes, to one last image of them, moving gently through a sky that is letting go of the light. So picture it now, one last time, in the quiet of your own mind. A great silver airship, vast and gentle, drifting slowly across an evening sky. There is no hurry in it, no roar, only the soft hum of distant engines and the slow passage of the clouds. See how it catches the last of the light along its great curved flank, glowing softly against the deepening blue. The little windows are warm and golden, and behind them, perhaps, a few travelers sit quietly, watching the evening come on. No one aboard is in any hurry at all to arrive. Below it, the world is settling into night. Lights are coming on in far-off windows. The sea is turning dark and calm, and the day's long noise is fading into stillness. The great ship moves above it all, unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world. It does not matter tonight that such ships no longer truly fly. In the soft country of memory and imagination, they sail on as they always did, lit silver by the moon, carrying their few passengers gently between the stars and the sea. The dream is allowed to keep flying here, where nothing at all can bring it down. Think of everything it held. The patient old Count and his impossible vision, the smooth and quiet voyages, the dining rooms suspended in the sky, the fragile beauty of a thing that floated rather than flew. Think of how it rose and how it fell, and how something of it lingers still. And then, gently, you may let all of it go. So let your shoulders grow heavy and your hands fall open and still. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, and nothing you must remember. You can simply lie here and let the great ship carry the story onward without you. For you do not need to hold any of it tonight. Not the names, not the dates, not the reasons it faded from the sky. Let the story settle softly around you, the way snow settles, or the way a great ship settles slowly toward its rest. Outside, the night is wide and calm, and the stars are coming out one by one. The same sky that once held those great silver ships now holds only the quiet dark and the moon and your own slow drift toward sleep. It is enough tonight simply to rest beneath it. The room is quiet now. The day is behind you, and there is nothing more that needs doing, nothing more to solve or to carry. There is only the night and your slow and easy breathing and the soft weight of sleep beginning to gather. Somewhere in a sky that might have been a silver ship is still drifting through the dark, carrying its passengers gently home. And here, in the small shelter of your room, you are drifting too, down toward a deep and peaceful rest. The world slows, and so do we. Let the great ship sail on without you now. Let the sky hold them, as it always did, while you let go of the day and sink softly into sleep. There is nothing left to do now but rest. Good night.